Hi everyone, my name is Andreas Kofler. I'm curator at the Swiss Architecture Museum and I'm welcoming you tonight at the Swiss Architecture Museum actually. This lecture was supposed to be somewhere else at the Ackermannshof tonight, which is a place here in Basel, and due to COVID-19 regulations we decided to don't have a public lecture tonight but to stream it live on YouTube. So some of you may be puzzled to find us actually here in the middle of the Swiss Architecture Museum. I'm welcoming you tonight for the lecture of Tsuyoshi Tane, who's right next to me, and who came over, was so friendly to still come over to Basel to give this lecture inside his actual exhibition. So it's a very strange and particular format, but it's kind of exciting to do something experimental tonight. We are surrounded by the models of Tsuyoshi. We are surrounded also by sounds we can hear of the exhibition. So I apologize for these sounds that you may hear, but they're kind of cute to hear them in the background. And I'm introducing briefly Tsuyoshi for those who don't know him, but I imagine who tuned in tonight may already have an idea who he is. Tsuyoshi Tane is born in Tokyo in 1979. Please correct me if I'm wrong. He studied in Hokkaido, so in the very north of Japan, at the Tokai University. He also studied in Denmark at the Royal Danish Academy of Fine Arts. He worked in Denmark at Henning Larsen, and he also worked in London for David Adjaye. And founded in 2006 an office in Paris called TGT with his two former partners, Dan Dorell and Dorell.Ghotmeh, who all now have independent offices, as well as Tsuyoshi, who founded his office in 2017 and to who we dedicate the current exhibition at the Swiss Architecture Museum called Archaeology of the Future. A reminder for those who are really live right now on YouTube is that you can ask questions. We're going to collect them and ask them at the end of Tsuyoshi's lecture. Actually, Andreas Ruby is preparing a small interview with Tsuyoshi for the end of his lecture, and then we're also going to ask eventual questions that arise during his lecture, and you can freely ask us and post in the chat you find underneath this YouTube stream. But now I'm handing over to Tsuyoshi, who I'm thanking again to have come to Basel tonight.
Thank you. Okay. Good evening, and thank you for Andreas, and also thank you for Swiss Architecture Museum. It's been very honor for us to be really participating in such a great, let's say, show and also doing this lecture. So today it's an opportunity for us to introduce what we do through the lecture, and it's okay. So the office is called Atelier Tsuyoshi Tane Architects. It's been called at ATA. We have been sort of formed as, let's say, international young group of architects, around 30 people, based in Paris. As sort of the way we work as sort of collaboration among all these international, let's say, collaborators to think what we do as sort of the stage of this contemporary architecture. And the great opportunity arrived to exhibit for our more than, let's say, 10 years of work at the Swiss Architecture Museum at a traveling exhibition called Archaeology of the Future. Just briefly, we would like to introduce sort of the main entrance that is called this sort of the space to introduce the sort of manifesto, as well as sort of trying to collect the demolished piece of the pieces in Basel to create sort of in situ site-specific installation to present this sort of archaeology of the future. And coming to enter the gallery spaces to show all this sort of our work was through the models and many of the images, over 500 images that are made as archaeological researches, as well as the showing to display sort of small part of the models and the object which holds sort of the memory to represent the part of the project. At the back of the also gallery space, which has sort of the, let's say, three main projections, which represent sort of series of the sort of through the movies, by showing to travel from one space from Estonia to Tokyo and Paris and then sometimes Switzerland. So to sort of being in one space to traveling around the world. And also like specifically, we also putting this sort of over 10 years of work as sort of timeline, which represent the time of where we are here in this sort of lecture space. The theme, I would like to introduce the work of what we do through the idea of the archaeology of the future. So you can see the image of New York as sort of the one of the greatest city, and also I love the New York in a way that sort of this excitement and the energy of the city is very, very strong. At the same time, because of the success of this making the urban structure as sort of the success of this 20th century model of making the city, becomes sort of spreading the idea in the world. So by looking at the sort of cases at the heart of the city, in the center, this limited land turn into sort of taller building as sort of creating the spaces. So the center of the city getting taller and taller to densify in order to create more quantity of spaces. At the same time, this another phenomenon happened like after late 20th century, that many of the people from countryside is trying to come over into the city. Therefore, this sort of expansion of the city gets horizontally wider and wider. So you may see this sort of image that look like almost somewhere, but actually it's in São Paulo in Brazil, as well as the image that you can see look like one of the eastern countries, but actually it's a suburban area of the Shanghai. So therefore, no longer in sort of urban generic sort of idea of the city become almost unknown landscape. And after a while, there are sort of the life of the building has been getting even shorter due to sort of modernization. So after a while, the life of the building getting sort of being demolished and then crashes and being rebuilt. And one of the images that you can see is look like more familiar. It's part of the one of the let's say outer scarf of Paris. But at the same time, you can see on the right bottom of the corner, which is under construction. And when I see this sort of situation that were sort of somehow uncomfortable, to realize that somehow this kind of modern building, again, to be demolished earlier than the sort of existing situation of Paris, at the look of being Paris. So somehow, as an architect, we have been educated to build our society and the future based on the modernity. And this kind of modernity and the modern architecture has been, let's say, demolished earlier than the building has been there at Paris. So we wonder what can we believe into the future to even continue to create what we do as architects. So then idea came up sort of way, more than 10 years of thinking, that maybe we could look more backwards to get this idea of archaeology. So the archaeologist going to the site to excavate, to collect the object. And in order to make it sort of discovery, which create the continuity of the future. That's how we wanted to learn from this sort of the process of archaeologist. By starting the project, we don't start to design the project, but actually trying to excavate as an archaeologist to collect those sort of memory of the places in order to come up with different idea in order to create the concept of the project. And today I'd like to introduce, let's say, 5 projects. Started from one of the first, the largest project that has been built from 2006 to 2016. And the project is a Estonian National Museum, which has been announced at the public open competition for, let's say, in 2005. It was announced for like young architect or even architect, it be open at the publicly to participate for designing new building for the Estonian, let's say, National Museum. And as you may know, the Estonian has been sort of been part of the occupation period by Soviet Union. But in 1989, 1989, when there was sort of one of the memorial periods to have sort of the demonstration called Baltic chain. So over 200 kilometers between the Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, the people holding hands to sort of demonstrate for the wish of the independence. So after such an event, then they got the sort of independence in 1991. But at the same time, to construct this national museum for Estonia, actually the Estonia has been part of sort of bigger powers between the sort of 13th century from Denmark, or 16th century Sweden, or Russian, German, and Soviet Union. So how can we sort of represent as Estonia as sort of continuous memory from those different periods into the one sort of today's situation? At the competition, it's been given as a site which has been marked as sort of oranged area, which was a given site as sort of everybody as architect trying to think what it could be the building to look like at the museum. At the same time, on the right on the top, as you may see this kind of blanked area, which somehow being very weird and somehow erased land has been there. So you wonder why and what is kind of situation is there. So by looking at the sort of condition, actually there was a large piece of airfield has been dominantly occupied this land. And by looking at the situation, actually it realized that it was built by the Soviet Union at the air base to occupy this land. And after this discovery of the memory, we could not ignore the fact, we could not erase this sort of situation as the evidence. So literally, we just simply present to continue this sort of like large airfield turning into the national identity of the Estonian Museum. So building a seat at sort of long stripes to continue to announce the entrance, and then going back towards to the roof inclined to meet on the airfield. The building is kind of 72 meter wide. The length is 355 meter long. And together with sort of airfield become almost 1.5 kilometer of large sort of construction to be extended. At the same time, so this like large museum, it's not just a building, actually it's become sort of complex of the public spaces in order to just host the exhibition as well as creating the event and having libraries and then also all the function of the conservation department and the exhibition department and the storage and so on. So at that stage, the competition to propose to have sort of announcement to invite the guest at the main entrance of the museum. At the same time, sort of building in the northern country, the winter time it will be completely wiped out in the snow. At the exhibition space would be sort of holding this sort of timeline of the main spine of the space to be continued from the entrance, central entrance part to be the end of the exhibition and the exit. At the end of the sort of the museum exit, somehow we wanted to pronounce to change, to transform the scale of the, let's say, space. So at that stage, we represent to take this sort of Louis Brugger as a spider to represent the transformation of the scale to be changed. And also like this kind of a negative memory as an airfield and turn into sort of narrative, let's say, memory to be written as a sort of Estonian story to be, let's say, described on the airfield to change the meaning of the place. And the winter time also like becomes sort of the sort of snow covers entire landscape, becomes sort of looking towards the future as sort of continuity of the airfield and become sort of museum roof as a public, let's say, force facade. And miraculously, as we are a younger group of architects, and surprisingly, the first time we participate at the competition, when I was 26, and surprisingly winning the first prize. At the next day, sort of our initial idea becomes sort of a cover page of the newspaper in Estonia, was a surprise. But another surprise was actually one of the, let's say, expert at the jury, the historian of the Estonian architect, that's been strongly against, let's say, our idea. So she wrote large, let's say, article negatively speaking about this is one of the mistake that Estonian has been decided as the architecture of the Estonian National Museum. So this sort of idea spider becomes sort of a symbol to sort of against invading back this sort of Soviet Union for this kind of project again. So national debate started back this kind of, let's say, historian to start, let's say, against the idea, and has been sort of become sort of the national debate between whether these projects are good or not. Lastly, they become sort of weird caricature on the news sort of paper to being like honorably, let's say, drawn by. And after a while, like luckily this kind of big debate has been calmed down, and then it took almost nearly 1 year that we signed a contract to really start working on this project. So this is one of the early, let's say, photographs that we were visiting the site with the client, almost being nowhere to look at the sort of future museum. But at the same time, also this kind of negative media has been spread all over the Estonian sort of citizen. So we have to go around to meet the city mayor or other people to represent the concept are not really a kind of misunderstood concept that we try to describe and explain about it. And another moment, also surprisingly, suddenly after the competition that we won, the large, big construction company arriving to us to say that your project are too expensive, we have to change your project, already just right after the competition. At the same time, design process are also like such a large project, over 34,000 square meters, that's been sort of bringing from Paris to Estonia, like bringing large model to discuss with the Estonian people, the client. And one of the moment also there was somebody coming to tell us that, oh, I have a very great idea that I want to show you. So he's actually the city county mayor. He had the idea that he wanted to introduce his idea into our project, which was sort of having this sort of master plan of the county area. And as you can see, sort of our museum and then sort of concept of the airfield has been chopped off by the sort of ring road to create sort of large, let's say, traffic, as well as making sort of a green, let's say, land at the golf course, as well as football courts, and then hotels and hockey court, as well as some supermarket with large, let's say, a hypermarket, they call it, with a lot of, like, let's say, parking around it. Even they are ready to prepare all this 3D modeling to show that they are ready to build. And we were invited to have a sort of conference between the investors and then also this county mayor, that as if we have to say yes. And we have been pressured, and then we look like very angry, but at the same time behind us there are very, very, let's say, strong guy pressuring us to say yes. So we are sort of having a very difficult situation. Then we were asking through calling Estonian architect as well as one of the jury member, the Vinimas from MVLDV, and to sort of having a workshop to preserve sort of this kind of, let's say, airfield as historical monument at the let's say, landscape of the park. Then trying to sort of having compromise, let's say, between us and then investor to, let's say, make sort of master plan to be working together. And unfortunately, it was the situation was 2008 and 9 that the sort of big, large crisis in Europe has been sort of, let's say, abandoning sort of all this the development project, and then all the investors disappear. And same time, the Estonian museum finance has been very, very having a difficult time. So 2 times to call for this European cultural investment has been rejected, and the budget has been very having trouble. So the project has been stopped nearly 2 years that it's been not happening. Unfortunately, in 2013, that the decision in the sort of large parliament decision in Estonia decided to really move forward this project. So quickly the tender organized and then has been chosen as a construction company. So 2013, this kind of finally the project started. So over 34,000 square meters of construction, and every time we've been visiting every month to see checking the construction as sort of first project has been strongly large, let's say, structure. And then non-stopping sort of even winter time to still working at the construction site. And then one day I was called to be on site to check this sort of the mock-up of the glass facade, which has been ready. So when I was visiting on site, there was a piece of, let's say, 60 by 60 glass sample has been prepared. And then the contractor said you have to choose from this kind of small sample. But then I was surprised that like after 8 years of waiting to choose the sort of one of the great image of the building, the facade, has to be chosen from small 4 samples. And then we said, no, I cannot choose this kind of small sample. Then the guy just brought from his car to show another sample that what about another one? Then trying to push us to choose this sort of, there's a final choice. So it was very difficult, and having a difficult time that we have to choose like almost, let's say, 2 both facade with entrance, almost nearly 1 kilometer of entire glass facade has to be chosen from small sample. So I asked them to wait for tomorrow morning because the lighting condition changes and the appearance will be changed. Therefore, just waiting to take a decision next morning. So coming back next morning, the appearance has been changed, but surrounded by over 30 people, the contractor has been very, very pressuring to say which one we have to take. And I have getting sort of having difficult time and also almost nearly having stomachache that I have to say something. So at the end, to present sort of this right at the top of the corner one, this is the one that we're going to choose. But suddenly, by saying this choice, which one we want to take it. So somehow, after just one voice of saying that this one, that somehow this kind of feeling of the strong emotion came back to say that actually being architect is not just design the building, but actually choosing the vision of the future. So after this choice, quickly the glass has been produced and then covering entire sort of the glass facade becomes sort of main image of the project. And this kind of choice has been made based on the sort of the very important tradition of the symbol of the octagram in Estonia called octagram. It's representing the hope of Estonia, has been sort of covering entire facade of the museum. So as you can see, sort of this kind of let's say, time lapse of 36 months of construction and has been built up like all the people's participation to construct entire large construction of the building. And nearly taking like 36 months of construction to be built and finally forming as sort of the museum space. So museum has been built in 2016 and has been sort of open for public. And then sort of at the entrance area, it's kind of creating, let's say, large canopy space to be invited for people to come at the public entrance. And at the same time, sort of the reflection would be, let's say, Estonian landscape has been sort of being important reflection of the landscape to represent on the facade. And the winter time would be sort of almost white outing the entire, like, let's say, snow. So sky and the land become sort of almost, let's say, merging into the beautiful landscape. And then entering to the museum, so the roof has been raised up at let's say, 11-meter high, and the open public space to be able to discover different sort of journey into this sort of experience. The public space has been open for different visitor, different height, and then discovering different view. Even this conference room has been not been closed and having sort of small windows, and also the back of the stage can be sometimes open towards the lake. Even the museum acts as more public space for people to come. So in the weekend, they're always been having sort of public event in the middle of the museum space. And then also restaurant turn into sort of public event space that you can sort of looking towards the forest as an Estonian national, let's say, landscape. And the winter time becomes sort of completely white out. By coming to the sort of the exhibition spaces to have sort of entering into the sort of timeline starting from today's Estonia towards to the ice age of Estonia. So starting from sort of the one of the office chair, which was founder of Skype, has been set in the sort of creation of the Skype, our starting point of the collections, and backwards towards looking at these sort of different, let's say, ethnographic collections with daily object and sort of looking backwards to the history of Estonia. At the same time, also, the museum is not being built for the exhibition. So, like, large number of collection has been discovered the sort of underneath of the collection of the exhibition spaces. And then arriving to the back of the building, you can see sort of the roof has been sort of compressing towards the back of the building, and then suddenly going out to the airfield, and that becomes sort of almost meeting to the infinity view landscape of the Estonian National Museum. And the winter time becomes sort of like white in the snow, with sort of in the evening time becomes sort of beacon of the light to lead the sort of the neighbors. So the end of the September 2016, there was sort of the president came to have sort of really strong wish of the Estonian nation to celebrate for the opening. So over 6 hours of broadcasting to celebrate sort of the greatest moments for the Estonia, to have a sort of small concert, and then traditional costume that people gathering and then entering to the exhibitions, and having different thematic of the theater play and has been performed. So there's a small video clip that you will be able to just see the project. And next project that I would like to just show you as a sort of a challenging project for participating the sort of the competition for new national stadium of Japan for Olympic 2020. So the competition has been announced in 2012. Actually, it was sort of in the city of Tokyo. And then stadium has been built in the 1964 for the first Olympic in Tokyo, to build sort of main stadium. So after the nearly, let's say, 60 years, that the sort of the inviting 2020 for Tokyo Olympic to rebuild this sort of existing stadium, turn into sort of new main stadium of Japan. So the main jury was Tadao Ando, the architect. He was asking for calling the sort of the architect to sort of having 21st century for the new stadium to represent the global issue and the environmental issue to be sort of, let's say, taken into the account. But at the same time, also it was sort of big debate in this sort of competition because of the architect who can participate. This competition was very highly restricted, and it's been debated a lot in Japan. That actually the condition that you have to have either Imperial Prize in Japan, or Pritzker Prizers, or RIBA, AIA, or UIA gold medalist who is able to participate for this competition. So I didn't have none of those, let's say, greatest gold medal, but the second category, there was potential, let's say, participation that as if you are able to build over 15,000 spectator stadium, you are able to challenge for this competition. So even this second category that we didn't have it, but we've been asking to call for some French architect who has experience for this stadium. So one of the office called Atelier Architecture in Montpellier, that they are fine to collaborate with us. So finally we got a partnership to collaborate for this competition. As you may know, sort of Olympic started in Greek, that are sort of having that stage that they are not able to construct large, let's say, stadium. So actually to excavate the ground in order to invite for people to participate, in order to make people together. But in 20th century, sort of this urban strategy has been sort of having the issue of the sort of traffic and the evacuation, and also like so many like thousands of people needs to come into the one location. So this urban structure needs to have a sort of large stadium to be always suburban area in order to have sort of those sort of urban conditions to be solved. But in Tokyo 2020, in order to rebuild the existing, let's say, stadium, turn into sort of like place for over 80,000 spectators stadium that needs to be held at sort of nearly oversized, let's say, scale. And then back to this sort of the memory of the place. Actually, this land on the right side has been given site, but at the same time, this kind of left side, this sort of two area has been given as sort of Meiji Empire, let's say, celebration when the Meiji Empire has been sort of dead in order to celebrate for this kind of his greatness. So one of the left side is called Meiji Jingu, the sort of place for having the project of over 100 years forest project. Has been participated by young people to start planting sort of idea of 100 years forest. So sort of planning as a sort of landscape of trees are generation by generation in order to create sort of 100 years forest. But at the same time, sort of the right side of this kind of the area has been called Jingu Gaien, which was being given as a sort of museum and a sports for sort of modern activity of Japanese people. But the time after the World War II and having Olympic or after different event happened, that this kind of meaning of the place slowly and gradually disappeared. And this is today the situation that it was sort of the site has been sort of surrounded by this kind of context. Then we came up sort of idea to really go back as far as we could go. So to came up this idea to really having it as sort of a Kohun, which is one of the historical monument in Japan, in ancient culture. So this Kohun has been sort of one large, let's say, monument as sort of grave for empires. And actually, this is more bigger than the Egyptian pyramid at like a scale. And then it's been spread over 30,000 Kohun all over Japan in ancient culture before Chinese culture arrived. So between 3rd to 7th century, this idea of Kohun to make a place for, let's say, memory in the all over Japan has been there. So we thought this kind of the idea that the Olympic becomes sort of the largest event of today in 21st century, and to combine with the sort of largest ancient, let's say, monument of construction of Japan, ancient culture, to be into one architecture. The proposal is sort of becomes sort of one large, let's say, mountain look like sort of the stadium. Actually, sort of giving the form to be like, let's say, as a land, let's say, mark, that if you can also having a staircase to go up to the roof, that you can see 360 degrees of Tokyo from sort of forested, let's say, roofscape. So building sits in the sort of middle of the, let's say, urban condition to be sort of creating another project of 100 years forest. And then same time sort of excavating sort of this kind of great, let's say, the green roofscape turn into sort of excavation of the people together. So having sort of more central, let's say, spectators layout that people can concentrate for different matches. And at the same time, this kind of transformation of the spectator, let's say, seating area becomes sort of football, let's say, cases. And then we built like, let's say, almost 1 to 100 scale model for the exhibition in Japan in 2018. And also like this kind of the stadium is not just being built as a big stadium, actually becomes sort of micro environment, which can be also collecting the water to spread the sort of forest to cool down the urban condition, as well as sort of like if there's no event in the stadium, so the large energy generator can be sort of sharing to the neighbors. At the same time, learning from sort of this 100 years forest project in the Meiji Jingu, so we wanted to continue sort of idea into our project So from north to the south, people can come and plant these sort of trees. And finally, this sort of competition that we are sort of selected as a finalist. And among these sort of great architects, the Sana Toyo Ito, and then finally, the Zaha Hadid, she was one of the strongest projects that being sort of selected as the winner. And unfortunately, we lost this competition. But surprisingly, after a few years, that this project has been like over budgeted and also needs to be rushed into the construction. So it's been replaced by sort of the another project, and then suddenly, finally, it's been built in 2020. Then the Olympic, it's not happening yet. Maybe next year. And the next project that we is called the Hirosaki Contemporary Art Museum, which is one of the last projects that we have been finished this summer. And these projects are not being built from the scratch. Actually, it's been built nearly 100 years ago in Hirosaki, at the north part of Japan, and one of the sort of factory for sake. So the founder, even maybe his business were not successful, but could be this kind of brick building never been done in this condition that could be staying for the future for Hirosaki. So it's a great sort of the let's say ambition from this kind of founder to construct this sort of, let's say, imported cultural brick structure into Japan to build in Hirosaki. But after many decades happened, that this kind of building has been almost, let's say, production stopped and then being empty for nearly 20 years. So building has been sort of, let's say, unused and being sort of open storage area and then being sort of other condition. So city of Hirosaki decided to sort of make this kind of project not being demolished, but actually trying to, let's say, renovate for the contemporary art museum. But this competition has been given as a sort of public, let's say, project, but needs to be solved over 60 restriction and regulation of Japan in order to support this structure. But if you follow exactly this kind of building, let's say, regulation, it's become very normal, let's say, reconstruction of this kind of old heritage. So we were wondering, so how can you preserve sort of historical heritage, not to be just become a renovation, or not trying to being an extension, but we wanted to make it as a continuation, as a sort of concept of this project. So in order to make it sort of how this kind of historical, let's say, heritage can be continuation of the future. So first of all, like the first intervention in order to, let's say, reinforce the, let's say, structure for earthquake. Usually this type of old building, we have to use sort of, let's say, steel structure that the brick becomes sort of, let's say, facade as a decoration, and then to have a new structure to be built, let's say, constructed. But we were sort of having sort of, let's say, a steel rod from top to the bottom to make a sort of 36 millimeter tube in order to connect from top to the bottom to be able to reinforce to have a compression. And so the sort of soft brick becomes sort of compressed as a, like a strong, stiff structure that we could preserve from outside and inside without any kind of, let's say, damaging the appearance of the bricks. But in another way that also this like factory has been in the one of the case in the after World War II in Japan, there was no rice in the field, but then there was a lot of apple in this sort of Hirosaki area. So they are importing the technique of this apple turning into this like apple cider from France, and become sort of first production of apple cider in this factory. So in order to symbolize this sort of almost forgotten memory, to make it as sort of the cultural symbol as a roof, and become sort of titanium, let's say, cider golden roof. So this becomes sort of the image of the contemporary architecture to represent, to sort of forgotten memory turned into the cultural memory. So the building has been, let's say, having it as sort of welcoming for the public visitor at the entrance. And then finally, we won this competition. So after the construction, sort of like carefully, let's say, knocking down for this kind of, let's say, old roof, as well as sort of this taking out some of the floor and become sort of large, let's say, open space. Even excavating to sort of reinforce this kind of old foundation to be able to, let's say, remake it. And then learning from sort of technique from Italy or France, sort of preservation and conservation technique of old historical building, learning from this sort of way to be careful to not being renew it, but actually being sort of continuing the sort of the time has been, let's say, collected into the surface of the bricks. In another way, but also like sort of covered this kind of stucco at the white wall that we trying to remove, then discovering to rebuild this kind of old 100 years, let's say, brick to be part of our, let's say, new project. So time is sort of even going backwards to rebuilding this sort of old brick surface into our project. And then finally, sort of coming up to this sort of structure, and then also reinforcing sort of this, let's say, steel rod, as well as let's say, installing all the golden roof, turn into sort of, let's say, titanium roofscape. And also concrete floor, we cover it up with sort of, let's say, brick walls. And then also entrance has been taken out, but then trying to, let's say, pushing sort of brick to create sort of like brick canopy space at the dome in order to sort of structurally make it work for the Hirosaki, let's say, entrance. So finally, this kind of a project has been finished this year, and then being opened in the July 2020. And then being sort of the roof has been gradually changing according to the lighting condition because of the titanium, let's say, appearance. So the surface has been greatly changing by the everyday sort of lighting condition. And then sort of welcoming to the entrance for the, let's say, guest into the sort of public space. And as a sort of continuity of this sort of experience from entrance to the sort of entrance foyer, and then same time going up to the sort of upper floor for the libraries. And they look like sort of old structure of the roof, but actually we've been reinforcing it to, let's say, make it work for the sort of structure to be stabilized. And then gallery space is also like removing also one of the floor to create sort of large 50-meter high ceiling space to have sort of contemporary art piece can be having more, let's say, multi-directional, let's say, experience. So one of the exhibitions has been installed, it's called Thank You Memory, as a sort of collective, let's say, group exhibition to start it for different artists from different culture, and then sort of New York, India, and from China and Japan to be participated to create sort of first exhibition. And also like one of the house has been next to the building has been also kept the sort of preserving this sort of place for turning to the cafe and then also restaurant and the gift shop. So we are also installing sort of this kind of idea for cider production as people can participate and come to drink in this restaurant. And then being finalized this kind of, let's say, project. And the next project is called the Todorogi House in Paris, Bari. It's sort of small, let's say, housing which has been built. It's in Tokyo. And Todorogi is sort of, let's say, small Bari in sort of middle of Tokyo at the one of the high density of the residential area. And then it's been sort of having almost first time that we have to design the house in Tokyo. The building is being surrounded by sort of, the site is being surrounded by sort of different typical Japanese houses. And how can you take this idea for making the like still having a like let's say good house life in Tokyo. So started from this idea that how this Todorogi area the environment, and then we let's say creating sort of a great housing project by starting for this kind of archaeological research and then coming to understand how we can make it work. And by looking at sort of this kind of climatic environment, because of the Bari condition, that the ground has been very much sort of humidified as a wetland, because of this kind of Bari has a lot of water on the ground. At the same time, there is a river which giving sort of large wind, which like let's say the forest and trees are sort of waving because of the wind that are happening by the condition of the Bari. So we took this kind of idea of really looking at the sort of extreme environment for dry land and the wetland into our global, let's say, environment. So by taking to sort of these primitive houses, how dry land people are able to build their houses, and same time wetland as primitive houses, how people are able to survive in this kind of like condition of the environment. And by taking sort of the extreme idea of this environment into sort of two different typology into one sort of piece of architecture, that we somehow coming up with this idea of some strange collages as masterpieces that we have never seen before, but very strangely matching this kind of dry architecture and wet architecture into one sort of piece of architecture. So by this kind of excited to sort of come up this kind of idea of extreme environment, the memory to be into one piece of architecture, to conceptualize other models. But at the same time, sort of urban conditions in Tokyo are strictly having sort of different regulation that we have to sort of keep it. So getting sort of different four typologies of regulation that we have to be sort of coming back to very sort of square type of the, let's say, layout as why normally houses are very much sort of box types in Tokyo. But in order to not to compromise great idea that we wanted sort of welcoming to break the volume into sort of welcoming the trees and the forest to be coexisting together. So some way we are building up different, let's say, model to be coming back sort of volume studies to be able to sort of holding idea into sort of our concept. And finally, the idea turned into sort of small conceptual model and becomes sort of the final idea and being built in Tokyo. The project is being built in Tokyo, but doesn't look like being in Tokyo. So somehow still living in Tokyo could have great, let's say, idea of having the house, living in the nature, to have a sort of being in this sort of living room, which is sort of sunk into 1 meter down from the ground level. So the forest has been raised up, look like sort of hold it into your, let's say, surroundings. And as well as the excavation of sort of the 1 meter down, so collection of all the earth is coming back, bringing back to the sort of the, let's say, earth wall, which humidifying sort of for the air into the sort of these ground levels. And going up to the sort of the master bedroom, which is middle of the forest, so being sort of surrounded by trees, and then being sort of being sleeping in this kind of area, and going back to the sort of up side of the like upper level. So the kids' room would be sort of up above the trees, and you can see sort of different like view to the city of Tokyo. The last project that I would like to introduce is sort of ongoing project, the latest project which we are working on now. It's sort of Sasahata Hatsu. It's sort of the project in Shibuya. And so the sort of this is the map in Edo, which is almost nearly 150 years ago, then built as a sort of water, let's say, canal as a sort of lifeline. So this kind of Tamagawa River, which is one of, this is our site, which was made for Tamagawa River as sort of lifeline of the water to supply from countryside into the Tokyo as a sort of very important connections. And then being sort of historically important sort of like a development of Edo, and then being built as a sort of this Tamagawa brothers who has been dedicated to sort of create sort of this kind of water canal to bring the sort of lifeline in Tokyo. But after many decades and then years and years passed, so this kind of area of this Tamagawa River becomes sort of forgotten area and has been sort of combined between the Hatsudai, Sasazuka, and Hatagaya into one sort of continuous, let's say, our sort of project. The site has been sort of being nearly sort of, let's say, sad condition, but the Shibuya wanted to have a sort of almost a high line to be activate this sort of forgotten land. So coming back to sort of idea to start it from the origin of this kind of Tamagawa River and to looking back to sort of this historical development. Even World War II has been greatly damaged this area, and then also coming back to this sort of residential condition from sort of countryside, people start living in this area and being built sort of the layers of sort of almost Anthropocene sort of layer of type of this sort of historical layering into the project. So somehow we came up with this kind of Shibuya and then also Tamagawa River, and how can we make it into our sort of conceptual idea into the project. So the sort of way we thought about in order to not make it as a highline, but trying to make it a sort of farm as a sort of idea to make it regenerate sort of this kind of forgotten land. So this kind of a Tamaga Joshi as a water lifeline becomes sort of green passage at the park. But then we wanted to introduce another layer of farming at the urban continuity. So this becomes sort of one of the idea that we wanted to convey into sort of the farm and bring the food, which becomes sort of place for community to create. And then community that people can participate at the food becomes sort of a way to have, let's say, base for the communication. So this kind of, let's say, this green passage at the park, nearly forgotten, becomes sort of the collection and accumulation of the food production in Tokyo or Shibuya. And then now we are planning sort of designing like over 3.4 kilometers of like, let's say, food at the sort of a river, and become sort of creating the participation of the public, and as well as sort of the urban development to generate this project. So finally, this kind of food river becomes sort of connection between the Shibuya and the Shinjuku area, and becomes sort of our next project for 2025. And then lastly, I would like to sum up sort of the idea that this all the project from the large project to the smaller project, that it's importantly we always think about sort of this memory of the place and space and time. Because of the idea that the place and the space, it's relatively we know what is a place and what is space. But it's kind of hard to identify where you can find a place in the space, or how can we call in the space to identify where the place. It's very difficult and very ambiguous. At the same time, this kind of time and the memory, that there is some kind of connection between the time and memory, but we don't know how to quantify the time in the memory, or how can you get the memory from the time being. So coming back sort of in a little bit deeper to understand how can you make it that place. So in a way, the place is become a singularity. So you cannot replace the place, or you cannot change the place. So the place is an idea of singularity in the one place, in the one spot, in the one place. And the space is an infinity. It's one of the introduction that I had in the earlier. So the space are able to construct taller and taller, or wider and wider. You know, in a way that space can infinitively produce and then multiply or divide. Anyway, space can be infinitively created. At the time, it's the idea of continuity. The time you cannot disconnect, you cannot change. The time never been stopped. Time is always being continuous. And the memory is the idea of a collectivity. So memory is not singular personal memory, it's a collective memory. So all the human history has over thousands of years that the memory has been collectively developing our society and culture. Without the memory, there is no more future. Therefore, the architecture is not just being building between the space and place, the time and the memory in being sort of putting us all in one to present the architecture. So this is a sort of the idea of what we are calling as archaeology of the future. And thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, our audience. There's about 60 people in the audience, and thank you very much for staying with us and coming to our show, even if you can't come to the SEM. But you gave us company in front of your computers, and some of you actually asked questions, and I would like to bring them in to Tsuyoshi, and so that you get them answered even if you're not here. So one of the questions was, for instance, do you do a lot of competitions? How do you actually acquire your projects? Do you proactively reach out to potential clients? Or do you try to scan the competition scheme and then pick the ones that you think are most suitable for you?
In a way, I have a problem over the competition because of when I start doing a competition that we want to win. Therefore, I may forget about the rest of the project and I want to concentrate to win the competition. Therefore, almost maybe one time or maybe two times per year that we do the competition. when we have a chance and we have a really challenging competition that we wanted to do it. And the rest, fortunately, the projects are coming to the office, and then we've been working like more, let's say, client coming and then trying to present the project. So in a way, these kind of two things that we try competition, definitely we want to do it, or the client is coming to work project together.
But would you say then a competition kind of streamlines your imagination in the sense that you try to do something that is winnable? Do you think you're more conditioned when you make a competition?
I think so. That is more the condition, and then it's not the we can win. So, like for example, the National Stadium of Japan, almost zero potential that we can win, but we want to challenge because of the challenge that we can really try to do something the project that we can push ourselves forward. That's the.
So you do competitions also in a way where you think
it's a challenge.
I'm sure I'm not going to win, or it's unlikely I will win.
Yeah,
but I want to do it anyway.
Exactly. That's the challenge we trying to not just looking for the winner, but just trying to challenge ourselves to look for this project.
Well, you did your first major project as a competition in Estonia, and that was a win. And you made yourself, I mean, you were a young architect then, you were actually still working in an office, I guess, at that time?
Yes.
Would you recommend that to young architects today? That was another question. To do the same thing? I mean, to try and open their offices as soon as possible? Or how do you think about that looking back?
It's kind of like some way, the chance is always coming on the right moment. So just my case was very early. I wasn't ready, but we tried, and then chance came, let's say, in my life to really change it. So therefore, our professional architect, we cannot work ourselves, but the chance coming either from the somebody wants to build or the competition is there. If you, let's say, open up your challenges and encourage yourself to create your, let's say, yourself to really project your life to be changed because of our work, the project can really educate ourselves and then, let's say, develop our potential. So this is why don't hesitate, just try and then do it. If nothing happens, try another one. And that's what I think.
Okay.
Yeah.
Here's a really interesting question by Jörg Himmelreich, editor-in-chief of Architecture magazine here in Switzerland, and he asks whether you're interested in ecological questions and more specifically actually in the possibility of architecture to serve non-human species. So I guess he's talking about animals and plants.
Okay.
This notion of archaeology I think is interesting because when you have an archaeological site, it's usually a site that is appropriated by nature. There's all kinds of animals that live in it. There's plants growing over. And so your notion of architecture is quite informed by this concept of archaeology. So how do you see your projects in that context?
I think like this kind of the idea that somehow this modernity that building and the use has been very much the human centralized idea that where people needs to be comfortable, building has to be served for people. But actually we forgot about this kind of, let's say, memories and the environment and the nature. Therefore, probably desire changed today, let's say, at the 21st century, not only because of the climate change, because of the desire and the comfort has been changed, especially I would say this kind of COVID, even our desire of the comfort, we don't want to go into the mass and also the crowded environment. Somehow, physically, we are very also adapting to the nature. Therefore, many projects that we are working on sort of thinking of the earth, which is not material, it's kind of contamination of the time being to the earth, are become sort of strong, let's say, element. Or the sort of the even, we don't want to be making a project of the green architecture, but actually wild nature coming to the urban condition becomes sort of living as strong as the urban condition, the nature being together. Therefore, I think participation of the more aspect of the different element that we people are like living all together between not only the environment, but also the depths of the time, should not be ignored. This is a, I think, important part of the archaeological thinking, which is going to be also looking for the future.
Has it ever been on your mind in an age where we know that humans are responsible for the extinction of a large part of natural species in the animal kingdom, especially, that architecture could be a tool to kind of reforest that kind of richness of species?
I think like because of we are able to even create the forest. We are able to bring the water from one side to the other side. Therefore, the human the ability that we can deform the sort of natural environment into sort of another like a nature. And then therefore, I think we are learning by doing this kind of, let's say, transformation of the nature. That could be also potential, let's say, the work of human, let's say, responsibility.
Yeah. I mean, speaking about forests, you proposed the forest on the stadium.
Yeah.
Why don't we go on the exhibition and
Okay.
have a look at it, and
Yes.
we can talk about it
Yeah.
a bit
Okay.
more?
Cool.
Yeah? So, Michelle will follow us with the camera. If I manage to get this off,
Oh, I don't know how to.
or we can just also do
Yep.
this.
Yep.
So, please follow us. So, this is, yeah, let's go over here a little bit here so she can look at this. So, I'm wondering really about, I mean, I'm fascinated by this project. This is such an interesting idea to conceive of a stadium. And what I was wondering is actually, how would you have used this forest? Actually, so we see there's the
Staircase.
You go up. Would it have been possible to go left and right from this as well, and actually go through the trees?
Yeah. So the plan that we have sort of three main sort of staircase to going up. There is a kind of two rings going around the stadium, and even from the ground and then another level, you can enter to the sort of spectator area. Therefore, more kind of walking to the forest, directly diving into the sort of, let's say, a sports event. So there are kind of very strong juxtaposition for forested area, diving to the sort of world event of the like sports. So this is sort of interesting, let's say, urban condition.
So would it have been a three-dimensional park in some way?
Three-dimensional.
Would it have been a three-dimensional park where I can walk around,
Yeah.
like in a park, but really here it's a hilly landscape?
Hilly landscape, and also the stadium, that if there is no event, the stadium is just being big box that nobody can use. But actually this kind of three-dimensional park, the people can go anytime, 365 days that people can participate and use it. So that's
Super. Yeah,
yeah.
it's fantastic. Okay, well, we can take up the idea of the non-human species, and we not only talk about animals, but also about, let's say, plants. We're quickly in natural resources such as wood, for instance. We can see that you work with wood a lot of times. And what I found very interesting is how you reuse wood, especially in this project in Kyoto. So maybe we can walk over there a little bit. It seems like you basically are harvesting or basically rescuing a whole material archive of wood from the 19th century that would be normally going to the trash.
Exactly.
Right? Can you describe this project or this process of working with the wood a little bit?
So this is one of the very ambitious projects in Kyoto. It's called the Cultural Factory. It's kind of being south of part of Kyoto. By working on this project, we discover that every day, because of again this kind of Olympic event, so this the tourism in Kyoto has been demolishing sort of old traditional machiya houses, and surprisingly, like over 8 to 10 tons per day, that kind of demolishing all this kind of, let's say, condition of the wood has been thrown out or being sort of recycling for the wooden chips for fire. Then we just thought that these are one of the samples that we took all these kind of abandoned, let's say, wooden pieces, and to be laminated. Then we thought about to make it as sort of this our entire facade can cover. So this is why sort of let's say, part of the participating to have demolition pieces into the lamination of the wood and turn into the construction of our entire sort of project. That's the idea.
It's interesting that in Europe there's a couple of tendencies where architects try to resource material that, like you do, that would be in buildings that are going to be demolished, and salvage them, catalog them, clean them, make them ready to be re-employed in buildings. There's an architect here in Basel, Barbara Buse, who has been doing this since the 1990s. There's this Belgium office called Rotor that you may have known, who try to do this also systematically. Is there anything happening like this in Japan? Because it seems to me that the lifespan of buildings in Japan is often quite short, like 25 years, and then you take the building down because you want to use the plot in a different way. Is there a material economy of cradle to cradle
stock or...
Yeah.
I think like this is one of the notion that I had, is that nearly 26, I think, 0.7 per year, this is the year of the lifespan of houses in Japan. But actually it's been not reality, it's just been marketed strategy to demolish and then rebuild because of the construction gets, let's say giving economy. But actually this kind of idea that it's been told that the Ise Shrine has been every 30 years to build and then rebuild. But that's not true, because there are many temples in Japan, like for example, Horyuji, which is one of the oldest, let's say, wooden construction in the world, has been there for over thousands of years. Basically, parts of the wooden pieces are able to remove and then rebuild in a way to learn by this kind of like archaeological pieces that we are able to take out, learning from the, let's say, ancient culture by remaking into sort of adaptation of today's way. So therefore, we can learn much more to do this kind of continuity as a sort of way to learn from the past to the future. That's what I thought architects can learn, not just modernize, but actually learn from the past to the future. It's more, I would say, the idea.
So you say this example of the Ise Shrine is more of an exception?
I would say so. This is more strong exhibition, symbolized sort of the, let's say, immaterial memory for generation by generation by learning, doing it. But that's not only one way. Actually, there are many, let's say, shrine and then temple in Japan. There are many people are learning by sort of transforming parts of the building into sort of new generation. This is more, let's say, I would say the flexibility of the wooden tradition.
So it's a more continuous kind of renovation of the material substance.
Exactly. I think it's been also European, especially Paris or European cities, has been adaptation and renovation to grow the city, not just to change and then remake it. So that's, I think.
Yeah. It's interesting.
Yeah.
Actually, you did this project. We can go over here in the cinematic space. This project in Paris actually works with these fantastic terracotta tiles. We're all surrounded now. Please come in, Michel. That is also an interesting history of material production, right?
Exactly. So this is a sort of small project in the middle of 11th arrondissement in Paris that's limited budget, but then we thought somehow taking this idea of terracotta as a primitive, typical, let's say, tiles in the countryside of France, and it's been preserved as sort of the, let's say, some women in 1950s to cut four corners to make the hexagon shape. So we took this idea to cover it up for floor and walls.
Yeah, it's interesting. We can go back to the exhibition where actually this project is exhibited. I have the feeling you actually you made this project as an homage to this specific type of production of terracotta tiles that was almost on the loose by industrialization, and that you tried to actually show that there was a manual way of making these things, and you wanted to support that. Are you a fan of craft?
I would say the craftsmanship, it's sort of the way that even Estonian, let's say, museum, all the wall has been made by stucco walls. Therefore, the sort of not a big fan of craftsmanship, but actually the time has been preserved into the material that I think is important. Therefore, not being produced from factory, put it in a very fresh finishes, but actually people touching and spending time to let's say, use or having a time to make it work, this is going to contain sort of very strong, let's say, memory of the material that can be in the space. It makes so much difference. That's why somehow the people spending the time is more giving a precious experience into the space.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Maybe we can go on a little bit in the show. Maybe one thing that I'm interested in is we see on the walls these many images.
Yes.
Actually, it's 1,000 images in the entire show, which your team bravely put up during a whole week. And in the middle we have these models, and obviously we have this feeling. Let's say maybe the image is this kind of research result that you do before you start, when you start a project, and then somehow through these images and the thinking and thinking through these images, it will help you to crystallize some patterns of a project and then to formalize a design. But is it really how you work in the office? Are you not tempted when you read a program of a competition to have some kind of idea out of your gut that you just draw down and think, actually, this is how it should be? Do you have the discipline to postpone this kind of initial idea and to say, no, I don't want to design something just like that. I want to actually really dive into the subject, and I want to kind of create this large landscape of possibilities out of which I will then develop something. How does it work when you make a project?
I think it's a very strange things. Is that even when we have a project, when we see the site or program, of course there are some quick instant idea coming up. But somehow, to me, sort of preconceived sort of image coming up is somehow we can already see and we can project the idea are not so interesting to me. So therefore, let's say, going to this sort of archaeological research to discover more surprisingly and somehow things that we have never seen before by really excavating something unknown, things that we trying to collect as a memory. And this surprise and then idea, for example, terracotta, I didn't know about the story. Or apple cider, we didn't know until we start making a project. So by understanding deeper, let's say, memory research and coming up, let's say, idea, that's more I can really believe in. And then something I have never seen before and we have never been able to project. Therefore, there will be a lot of stress, and then also we don't know it's going to be great. But then this becomes sort of idea that we want to generate, rather than being master sketch just being started and then built as much as just fixed in my head. So.
Yeah. Maybe let's go to the model of the Estonian National Museum. You say that you work a lot with the history of a site, and you try to use archaeology as an instrument to excavate the potentials of that place for a project. Now, I'd say in Europe after World War II, or let's say maybe in the postmodern period after the 1980s, more or less every architect would be very careful to do a tabula rasa approach and would always claim to kind of try to understand the history of a site and to work with this and respond to it with the intervention. In what way is your methodology different from that? Or does it kind of explore this path in a different way?
I'd say probably slightly different. Because of this sort of the history, we cannot change. And the history has to follow other authentic ideology of history needs to right way and the right decision, the right things to do. But what we are interested in is the more memory to excavate. So archaeologists going to the site, we don't know what come out from excavating and digging from the site. Therefore, by having sort of even discovering, sometimes archaeologists can change the future because of discovery has not been written on the history, but actually discovery suddenly century of something has not been written on the history are completely changing idea of what we understood. Therefore, this ideology of the archaeological idea can really more important and stronger gesture to create for the future.
I'm asking also because when I see some of the images here, these excavation images, I
Yeah.
think of a particular moment in postmodern history of architecture when Peter Eisenman made these projects. He called cities of artificial excavation. Where he was really fascinated with layers of ground inscription. His project, for instance, for Berlin, for Checkpoint Charlie, was actually inspired by that. You can't see it in the build project, but in his original project, he was actually excavating he was not only focusing on the wall, the Berlin Wall, which was there, but he also found that there was a Baroque city wall that was in the ground that you couldn't see. But he was trying to kind of relate these different kind of walls. So is there, do we have to imagine you as a Japanese version of a belated postmodern architect?
I'd say I had a talk with Mr. Hiroshi Sugimoto. He's an artist, but I start doing some piece of architecture. And we call it the lost modernist. Because we cannot see the future from a modernist. So we are lost in the modern period, but therefore we are going backwards as far as we can discover of our human history to recreate some sort of future. Therefore, not post-modern, but actually we lost modern, but then completely changing in a way that we approach.
Oh, that's
what
very
we do.
interesting. So you would say, okay, we're in still somewhat in the modern period, but we cannot project a future anymore as the moderns did.
I think so.
So it's like we're at the end of the corridor, we cannot go further, and we turn back.
Exactly.
And look what's there in the history, in the
that
past.
has more future because of the existence of the long-term the history. Art may continue than being modern or new. Therefore, we wanted to sort of stretch this kind of length of the time than just being new and new and new. So this is what we are thinking in a way that not heading to the modernist or postmodernist. Actually, we go backwards at the lost modern idea to backwards. And
that's interesting. Okay, so you're lost modern.
let's say postmodern.
Modernity has lost you.
Yeah.
Okay, so then let's figure out which condition has won you. So I guess we will return to the space in which you lectured and go through the exhibition a last time. And then Andreas Kofler can inform us a little bit about what kind of events we still have.
Okay.
Please take a seat. And I give the mic to Andreas.
Welcome back.
Thank you.
Are we back on? Yes, I think we are. Thanks, Tsuyoshi, for this extremely interesting lecture.
Thank you.
And also thanks to our so-called stream team for trying experimenting with us this very unedited format, which was kind of exciting. No?
Yeah, it was providing.
Yeah, it was a nice and very engaging way to replace the lecture we unfortunately can't have tonight. But I think this was full of potential. But there are other possibilities, COVID-19 permitting, to meet Tsuyoshi here in Basel. There's one coming up on February 4. There's going to be a triple lecture and a discussion at the Ackermannshof, and the subject is called Context, Pretext, Subtext, and it's a triple lecture and a discussion with Tsuyoshi, Katrin Gay from Gay Menzel, and Emanuel Christ from Christian Gantenbeim. So we very much look forward to this and hope it can happen. And if it can't, we're going to improvise something else because we kind of really enjoyed what we did tonight. There are some guided tours coming up. There's one on December 10 in German, there's one on January 7 in English, and one on February 11 in German. Also there, please check our website beforehand or our social network channels, because the situation can change. For now, these guided tours are still on. But we're also going to engage more online with you, like we did during the first wave of COVID-19. So we're going to increase our offer also on Instagram. So we're going to do some guided tours on December 2 in German. You're going to find it on our Instagram channel. It's going to be Andreas Ruby doing this. On January 14, there's going to be English and French on February 18. And a guided tour with Tsuyoshi Tane is already available on our IDTV channel on Instagram. Right. So there's also this chance. And last but not least, there's the exhibition itself, which you can visit until February 28. The museum is still opened. It adapted, obviously, to all the regulations we have and all to the sanitary protocol that has to be put on place. But you can visit our museum so far until February 28th. There's a chance to see the exhibition. And a little hint or a little recommendation, this Saturday, on the opening day of the Regionale, the entrance to the exhibition is for free. So you can also take this opportunity to visit the museum and the Kunsthalle. That's all I would say. I thank again Tsuyoshi Tane. I thank again to the audience who asked some extremely interesting questions. I thank Andreas Ruby and our streaming team for being there and for everyone who tuned in tonight. Thanks a lot and stay safe.
Thank you.